Okay. Now, in passage 3, in the first paragraph, author introduces two types of authority: intellectual authority and institutional authority. And he defines both of them. He says intellectual authority is based on good reasoning, while institutional authority is based on coercion or convention. So basically, arguments can either be grounded in good reasoning, or they can be supported by organizations, bodies, institutions, and grounded in convention. Okay. Then author discusses, or rather introduces, legal systems and says legal systems, interestingly, claim intellectual authority. In the second paragraph, author mentions some critics and their argument that legal systems do not possess any intellectual authority, they only possess institutional authority. But the author refutes their argument and he says intellectual authority does exist and it is separate from institutional authority. Okay. In the third paragraph, author gives us example of critics' rejection of intellectual authority, and he defends intellectual authority against critics' rejection. Finally, in the last paragraph, author concludes by saying that institutional authority in legal systems is also supported by or consolidated by an element of intellectual authority. If previous decisions taken by legal systems are found to be wrong, then judges are willing to reconsider these decisions because they do, for the sake of good reasoning, for the sake of logic. Therefore, legal systems also possess an element of intellectual authority. That's the final verdict. Okay. Question number 12. Which of the following most accurately states the main idea of the passage? As discussed, the main idea is that legal systems also possess intellectual authority, contrary to what many critics might want to believe. Okay. Option A. Although some argue that the authority of legal systems is purely intellectual, quite opposite. Some people argue that authority of legal systems is purely institutional. Author argues that it is intellectual. So this goes out. Option C also goes out. Factually twisted. Now between option B and D, B says, although some argue that authority of legal systems is purely institutional, these systems are more correctly seen as vehicles for applying intellectual authority. Correct. But there's a subtle semantic shift here. Author has not said that these systems should more appropriately be seen as intellectual in nature. No, he says they also have an element of intellectual authority. Not that they should better be seen as intellectual and not institutional. So there's a subtle twist. Also, the last part of B is wrong. Legal systems do not possess any coercive power. Is also contrary to facts. Option D should be the correct answer. Although some argue that authority of legal systems is purely institutional, these systems possess a degree of intellectual authority due to their ability to reconsider badly reasoned judicial decisions. Okay, perfect. Question 13. That some arguments never receive institutional imprimatur most likely means what? The meaning of the word imprimatur is acceptance. So this expression simply means that some arguments never receive institutional acceptance. They are not accepted by bodies, organizations, or institutions of authority. Okay. They fail to gain institutional consensus. Absolutely correct. Option A is what we are looking for. They fail to challenge. No. They fail to gain acceptance. They fail to conform to the example of no. They fail to convince by virtue of good reasoning. No. they fail to convince the institutions and not intellectuals. Okay. Which one of the following, if true, most challenges the author's contention that legal systems contain a significant degree of intellectual authority? Which means we have to prove that legal systems do not contain an element of intellectual authority. Let's see which option proves that they do not contain any element of intellectual authority. Option A says judges often under time constraints occasionally make badly reasoned decisions. Well, even if they occasionally make badly reasoned decisions, that does not mean the legal system do not have any intellectual authority. They still have intellectual authority. Okay. Option B, in some legal systems, percentage of uh, faultily reasoned decisions is higher than in other legal systems. Well, this is a comparative sentence rather than a general sentence. Author's argument was that legal systems in general contain intellectual authority. And option B says, even if option B is correct, only some legal systems have a higher percentage of faultily reasoned decisions. That does not mean in general legal systems do not have intellectual authority. So option B also does not disprove or weaken author's argument. Option C says many socially inappropriate legal decisions, which can be said to be poorly reasoned, are thrown out by judges only after citizens begin to voice their opposition. Achha. Now, please understand, even if judges are changing their previous decisions or previous decisions taken by the legal system, judicial system, even if they're changing it after citizens voice their concerns, ultimately intellectual authority, an element of intellectual authority is being added to the entire legal system. It might not be coming directly from the judges but indirectly from the public, but there is an element of intellectual authority. So option C also does not really weaken the author's argument. Let's look at option D. Judges are mostly subject to validation bias when reviewing previous legal decisions. Okay. Now, if they are subject to validation bias, it means they mostly deem the previous decisions correct, which means even if the previous decisions are faulty, they're biased towards them and they will validate the previous decisions. Now, this would challenge the argument that there is an element of intellectual authority, because this argument was based on the premise that previous decisions are reconsidered when they are poorly reasoned. But if they are not, if judges are subject to validation bias, that weakens the authors. Number 15, given the information in the passage, the author is least likely to believe which of the following. Okay. Option A says institutional authority may depend on coercion. Author believes this clearly. Here, he says the virtue of good reasoning, that is intellectual authority, does not depend on coercion. Institutional authority does depend upon enforcement, which means coercion. Okay. Therefore, option A is correct. Therefore, not the answer. Author would believe option A. Option B says intellectual authority may accept well-reasoned arguments. Correct. Institutional authority never does. Well. That's the whole point made in the last paragraph, the conclusion, that even institutional authority gives room for intellectual arguments or well-reasoned arguments. Therefore, to suggest that institutional authority never accepts well-reasoned arguments is opposite to author's belief. Option B should be the correct answer. Let's look at other options. Option C says institutional authority depends upon convention. Correct, written there in the first line. Intellectual authority never does. Exactly what the first line already marked says. So option C also author is likely to believe. Option D, intellectual authority sometimes conflicts with precedent. That is correct. Author believes this. Intellectual authority never does. institutional authority never does. Now, guys, with this part, second part of option D, author may or may not believe this. We don't have sufficient evidence for the same. That institutional authority never conflicts with precedent. In fact, if at all, author says, if institutional authority is dependent only upon convention, understand, if institutional authority is dependent upon convention, then it should go by the precedents already set. So it should not go against them. It should not be in conflict with them. Only because there is an element of intellectual authority involved, judges are willing to reconsider the previous decisions if they think they are badly reasoned. So option D also, in a sense, is something author would slightly agree with. Correct answer, option B. Question 16. Based on the passage, the author would be most likely to hold which one of the following views about the doctrine of precedent? Okay. Option A says, well, doctrine of precedent is present in the last paragraph. Option A says, it is the only tool judges should use. Well, quite the opposite. Author says, they should also use logic, they should also use reasoning. If a precedent is badly reasoned, they should be willing to change it. So it is the only tool judges should use. Opposite. It is a useful tool in theory, correct? Author believes this, but in practice, it invariably conflicts with the demands of intellectual authority. Author has not said that it always conflicts with the demands. Sometimes the doctrine of precedent, sometimes the precedent could be wrong, not always. So this is also exaggerated. It is a useful tool but lacks intellectual authority. Well, the precedent only has institutional authority, no intellectual authority, unless it is combined with the reconsidering of decisions. Absolutely correct. So option C should be the correct answer. It is often an unreliable tool. Author has not said that it is often unreliable. Sometimes the doctrine of precedent could be wrong or could be unreliable, not often. So this is also exaggerated. Okay.